Hello, my name is Madison Heasterman, and this is my presentation on how schizophrenia is affected by culture. When we look at the typical symptoms in schizophrenia patients from the United States, we see a few things. First off, we see hallucinations, and those may be auditory or visual. Next up, we see delusions, followed by reduced speaking and emotional abilities. And lastly, we see various cognitive problems, which may be something like poor learning retention or trouble with verbal information. The first study I looked at was done in 2011 to find out if culture had an influence on the frequency of different schizophrenic hallucinations. Schizophrenia diagnosed patients from Austria, Lithuania, Poland, Georgia, Ghana, Nigeria, and Pakistan were analyzed, tallying to slightly more than 1,000 people. Auditory and visual hallucinations ended up being the most commonly found hallucinations amongst the population. Looking at the entire sample, we can see that auditory hallucinations were the most prevalent. They were present 75% of the time in Ghana and Nigeria, and the lowest amount reported was still at a high of 66.9% in Austria. Visual hallucinations were the next most common, showing up about 40% of the time. Again, most common in Ghana and Nigeria, but this time the lowest percentage was reported in Pakistan. So, as we can see so far, the symptoms in all of these countries that are vastly different from the Western ones still have similar symptoms when it comes to schizophrenia. Similar symptoms were found in South Asia when over 300 schizophrenia diagnosed patients were analyzed to figure out the frequency of various symptoms using the Operational Criteria Checklist for Psychotic Illness. This checklist helps to ensure an objective diagnosis of all the patients. Delusions were by far the most common and almost ubiquitous symptom, followed not too far behind by hallucinations, with third-person auditory hallucinations being a very common type. So, as we can see here again, in yet another country that is vastly different from the Western country we live in, there are still some common universal symptoms associated with schizophrenia. However, the differences are going to start to show when we take a closer look at these hallucinations themselves. In 2015, a study was done to analyze the differences in auditory hallucinations between people in San Mateo, California from the United States, Accra, Ghana, and Chennai, India. 20 people from each country who had been experiencing auditory hallucinations for at least 6 months, many having been experiencing them for much longer, were questioned about their hallucinations. Everything from how often people heard voices, if they knew who was talking, and what the voices talked about, amongst other things, were analyzed. Although participants from all groups reported both good and bad audio hallucinations, not everyone ranked these experiences as being positive, nor were they equally reported amongst the groups. Firstly, those from Accra and Chennai insisted to them that their hallucinations were good, something that those in San Mateo never did. More specifically, those from Chennai almost always reported hearing the voices of family members. Those voices were extremely unlikely to be saying anything violent. The people of Chennai also uniquely reported what they heard as playful, the only ones in the study to do so. People from Accra were the most likely to report that they knew who was speaking to them. They also were very sure that their hallucinations were positive, even being hesitant to describe them as negative. However, those from the United States had very different reports. Patients from San Mateo consistently classified their hallucinations as violent and harsh. Some patients described their hallucinations as warlike or being told to practically mutilate people. Also, those from San Mateo didn't typically label their hallucinations as human voices, but if they did, it was very unlikely to be somebody that they knew. What we can take from this data is that those in the United States are far more and almost inevitably likely to experience negative hallucinations, while those in more interdependent societies experience more joyful hallucinations. One reason for this is because hallucinations have different meanings in different societies, as we learned in the textbook in Chapter 14 on page 552. Western societies typically view hallucinations as something being wrong with your brain, but other societies may view these hallucinations as messages from the gods or as the result of a ritual. This can make it hard to determine a set outline for mental illnesses and compare them globally. The next study I looked at specifically analyzed the prevalence of schizophrenia in minority groups in neighborhoods where they were also the minority. The main study population consisted of people from the Caribbean and Africa now living in London. Although they don't know why, this study found a positive correlation between how common a group was and the likelihood of schizophrenia. As a group became more of a minority in their neighborhood, schizophrenia became more common. As we see, being a minority can cause negative effects. Just like in the Australian Aboriginals, not having a strong sense of culture or being surrounded by people that are like you can result in poorer mental health, substance abuse, and lower socioeconomic status. All of these things have the possibility to speed up or worsen the process of schizophrenia. One of the less common but still prevalent symptoms of schizophrenia is violence. A study was done to try and find out the risk factors associated with schizophrenic adults by analyzing over 1,000 patients from 56 different sites around the United States. Patients or their caretakers were questioned about participating in violent acts over the last 6 months. Violent acts were classified in one of two ways. First, minor violence, which included simple assault without a weapon that did not result in any injury. The next type of classification was serious violence, which included assault or threatening using a weapon, anything involving injury, or any type of sexual assault. Psychotic symptoms were also measured using a commonly used clinical scale called the Positive and Negative Syndrome Scale, which rates psychotic symptoms on a 7-point scale, ranging from symptom absent to extreme symptoms. Two of the most common types of symptoms were analyzed: positive psychotic symptoms, which included delusions, hallucinations, and hostility, and negative psychotic symptoms, which included emotional and social withdrawal, difficulty in abstract thinking, and having a hard time with conversations or stereotyped thinking. From this study, 15% of the population reported minor violence, and only 3% reported serious violence. In addition, the psychotic symptoms hostility, suspiciousness, and hallucinations all positively correlated with higher levels of serious violence. The symptoms that had the most positive correlation with violence were a combination of delusional thinking with suspicious ideologies. A quote from our textbook on Chapter 14 reads, "Even though human biology is mostly universal, psychological disorders present themselves in different ways around the world, indicating that cultural variations are involved in the expression and experience of psychopathology. So, schizophrenia, like many other diseases, will inevitably present itself differently all around the world. However, there is one universal when it comes to schizophrenia. Blind people have never developed it. There have been many studies done to confirm this, but one of the larger ones was completed in 2018 by analyzing almost 500,000 people born in Western Australia over a 21-year period. Blindness was classified in one of three ways. First, they had those who were blind at birth, called cortical blindness. They had patients who developed some degree of blindness in childhood, called congenital blindness. And lastly, they had patients who cannot see something unless it is very close, peripheral blindness. Between those who were congenitally and peripherally blind, they made up less than 0.5% for those who developed schizophrenia later in life. However, not a single person with cortical blindness developed schizophrenia or any other psychotic disorder at all. Currently, we don't know exactly what it is in our visual world that makes such a big difference in this disease. There are currently many hypotheses as to why schizophrenia presents itself differently across cultures. One possibility could be the personal relationship differences in independent versus interdependent societies. According to the textbook in Chapter 6, interdependent societies consist of many close, personal relationships and adjusting oneself to fill their expected roles or behaviors. This strong sense of community in interdependent societies means those suffering from schizophrenia are less likely to be left on their own or to become homeless. Another possibility includes exposure to Western medicine. Societies who have been greatly exposed to Western ideologies are more likely to have been exposed to the United States' negative connotation associated with schizophrenia, thus making them more aware of symptoms and more likely to experience them. However, there are many other possible factors that could affect the outcome of mental diseases. Age, access to medication, social class, and the society's stigma around the disease and its symptoms, amongst many other things, can all affect how an illness is seen and thus manifests.